when you start asking questions about those lenses, you begin to conclude that actually the first generation of Muslim scholars actually had no idea what was going on. And the illustration I often use of this comes from, there was a really highly regarded Western critical scholar who worked on Islam for many years, Patricia Croner, based at Princeton University here in the US for many years. And she wrote a book called Meccan Trave, looking at some of the historical issues around the origins of Islam. But in that, she has a little discussion about the Hadith. And she uses it as her test case, the 106th chapter of the Quran, Surah 106, very short chapter. And by the way, if you've never read the Quran, you're listening to this and you're interested, go look that up on the internet. Very short chapter. And it talks about how Muhammad's tribe, he was part of a tribe called the Quraysh in Mecca, how they would go on 2 journeys during the summer and the winter. And they were afraid, but it was all right because Allah protected them from fear. And so Patricia, takes that surah and says, the inquisitive reader immediately begins asking some questions. Well, what journeys? Where were they going? What were they doing? What was the fear? What was the problem? What did they encounter? And how did Allah protect them? All these kind of questions arise. Right, she says, let's go to the earliest commentators on the Quran, sort of 100 to 200 years after the death of Muhammad, and see what they tell you. And she said it's astonishing. For every single one of those kind of questions, you can find 15, 20, 30 different opinions. Maybe they went there, maybe they went there, maybe it was this, maybe the issue was they were facing famine or drought or sandstorms or attacks from tribes or fear from being away from. So you look at all this wealth of suggestions and you can only arrive at the conclusion the first generation of Muslim commentators had no idea what the original context was. Maybe the right answer is in here somewhere. And she coins this little phrase. She says, how do we explain the fact this earliest generation of Muslim commentators had suffered exegetical memory loss in just a few decades?
Yeah.
And it raises all kinds of questions about the origins of the Quran.
Yeah.
But it does, when I talk to Muslim friends, I want to gently raise the question, how do you know that these commentators on the Quran, on whom you are relying, either consciously or subconsciously, how can you be sure they actually really knew what they were talking about? But without those lenses, the Quran, it's an interesting document.
Well, there was
meaningless.
I was having a conversation yesterday on the radio with someone who's asking about the history. What can we know about the history of the life of Muhammad, the life of early Muslims, et cetera, et cetera? And there's basically 3 different approaches. You can take a historical critical approach. You can take a traditional approach that just takes the traditions and just agrees with them. And then you can take a highly skeptical approach. I think there's 3 different, probably more than that. I think Patricia Crona and Tom Holland in The Shadow of the Sword and a few others.
Michael Cook and Alice Hagerism, for example, that classic book.
Someone would take a little more of a skeptical approach. Well, we can't know anything. Now, what they're not saying, this is important, a lot of them are not saying there is no real history here, that Muhammad wasn't a real person. They're not necessarily saying that. They're just saying, basically what you're saying is that because there's no real, who knows? It's not like there's nothing happened. It's that we just don't know.
No. And there's certainly, put it this way, that the curious thing, I'm a great believer in just leaning on the phrase, the curious thing is
yes.
Right. I think you mentioned in your introduction, Derek, that, if you don't know the Quran, you'd come to it going, well, I expect this is going to tell me about Muhammad and the things he did. Muhammad's only mentioned by name, 4 times, I think, in the Quran, which is interesting. Then the other thing I find fascinating is it takes over 100 years for biographical writing of Muhammad's biography to begin. The earliest we have is Ibn Ishaq, who is writing in about the sort of 700s, isn't he? And then we only have his biography preserved 100 years later in Ibn Hisham. So look, whatever is going on, the conclusion you have to draw is the earliest Muslims were not especially interested in the biography of Muhammad because they did such a terrible job of preserving it. Just contrast that with the Gospels and Christianity for a moment. Before we even get into which claim is true, what you cannot avoid is the conclusion that the earliest Christians were deeply concerned with the biography of Jesus. The dating for the Gospels, certainly all 4 Gospels, I think date before AD 70. And I think dating the Gospels has shifted earlier in recent years. Mark's Gospel, you can take someone like, say, Mark James Crossley, who's an atheist New Testament scholar in the UK. I mean, he's argued vociferously in recent years we should be dating Mark into the 30s. Well, certainly,
I gotta look that up. Yeah.
Fascinating individual. He's not a Christian, but he just thinks all the signs are there that this is incredibly early. But the point being is, within a couple of decades or so, the first Christians are writing down the Jesus tradition. It takes Muslims 100 to 200 years to get that figured out. That is just, at the very least, interesting.
It's at least the very least curious.
It's a very British phrase, I realise. Interesting, which raised an eyebrow.